Hello everyone, hope we're all well this Friday. So this live, there was three questions on the post, which all sort of tie into the same subject. I'll read them out first, and then I'll sort of go through them. One of them, hi William, I was wondering how long it takes for fab to kick in relation to alcohol, and through observation, I think I've noticed it in a few occasions within as little as 2 days. The next one is, I'm interested to hear more about fab and ambition. You mentioned in the books that has always in the past led to my drinking again. It's strange how all the awfulness of drinking could be forgotten so easily. And then the last one, I seem to have stepped into freedom, but have experienced this before. A friend told me I'm in the honeymoon period, but at some point my head will start messing with me. What can I do to avoid this fear, and what to do if sideswiped? Thanks. So I think the last few talks we tended to concentrate a bit on trying to get through those first few days and how difficult it is, and how when you get those first few days under your belt you get a bit more momentum and you start moving and it all starts to fall into place and become a bit easier. But there are some other mechanisms that fall into place and can start biting that actually mean the longer you've stopped for, the more likely you are to go back to drinking. And there's three elements. There's fab, which is fading effect bias. There's ambition, and there's the whole concept of sort of mental resilience. So there's three things, and these three things together kind of feed into the longer you stopped for, the more likely you are in many respects to go back to drinking. So I'll talk through them individually first. So fading effect bias is a psychological concept whereby human beings tend to look back on past events more positively than they were when they actually experienced them. So this is essentially what nostalgia is. It's looking back on the past and thinking it was great and fantastic, and weren't things great in the good old days. And it's this tendency human beings have. Now, the interesting thing about this particular tendency is it's universal. So it's not just in the West or in the East or in whatever culture. People all over the planet, from whatever background or culture, show this marked tendency to look back on past events, basically through rose-tinted spectacles, seeing it far more positively than it actually was. Now, it definitely exists because it's been noted and marked, as I say, across all cultures. No one really knows why it's there or what it does, but the prevailing theory is it just helps humans to have a more positive outlook on life. So they look back on their past and they see themselves a lot more positively. So it just helps to maintain sort of a positive outlook. But the problem is when it comes to drug addiction and stopping drinking, it can actually work against us, because what we tend to do is we tend to romanticise our drinking days. We tend to look back on our drinking and think it was far more positive than it actually was. So we tend to look back at the good times we had with friends and those wonderful drinks we had on holiday or at Christmas or whenever they were. And we have this tendency just to make it a lot more positive than it was, and it warps things. So actually, as you stop for days, weeks, months and even years, fading effect bias kicks in and you start looking back on your drinking days far more positively than it was when you actually experienced it. So that's a very important thing. So as you can see, over time, drinking becomes more and more positive. We tend to forget the bad and we tend to remember only the good. So when we look back on it, it's a much more positive experience than when we were actually living through it. So that's what fading effect bias is. The next thing I want to talk about is ambition. Now, this is sort of something I've come up with myself, and it's when I'm talking about ambition, I'm not just talking about it in the narrow sense as in, wanting to get that job promotion at work. I'm talking about it much more widely in the driving force behind not just humans, but all living things to want to better themselves, so to make their lives better. And that driving force is actually made up of two separate elements. Firstly, we tend to be quite critical of what we have, and secondly, we tend to idolise or fantasise about what we don't have. So if we have something, we're quite critical of it. We look at it very critically and we tend to find fault with it. But if we don't have something, we tend to make it out to be absolutely perfect. And again, we look at it through sort of rose-tinted spectacles and view it much more positively than it is. And it's almost that carrot and stick thing that drives us through life. So, you know, we see it with romantic relationships where you fall head over heels in love with someone and you want them really badly, and then when you start going out with them, reality kicks in and, you know, you start to get tired of them and sick of them and you bicker more, and that honeymoon period ends. You do it maybe if you want to move house or get a new job. You're looking at that new house thinking how life will be perfect when you get there, and within a few years it's too small and you're looking for the next place. Or with jobs as well, you kind of, when you're after a job, you build it up to be, you know, everything you've ever wanted, and then you get it, and within a few years, you know, you're bored of it and looking for the next one. And it's just this marked tendency. It does create the desire in people to want to take that next career step, but it's much more basic than that. And again, it can influence drug addiction and drinking hugely, because when we're mired in either drinking or addiction or whatever it is a very grim experience. It's not particularly enjoyable, and in fact the only enjoyment is relieving the withdrawal and misery caused by the previous doses of the drug. With alcohol, it ruins our sleep. We're constantly tired, we're grouchy, we're spending a lot of money that we don't want to spend, we're getting fat, we're pretty miserable, so we want to escape. But the problem is, when you do escape, again, as the days turn into weeks, into months, you start, drinking moves from something that you have into something you don't have. So again, you start to change and start to fantasize about it, start to make it out to be much more positive than it was. So that fading effect, bias and ambition are two similar things that have an almost identical effect. They're very different things, but they have the same overall effect. That means the longer you've stopped for, the more likely you are to look back on your drinking far more positively than when you were actually experiencing it. But the third thing I want to talk about is mental resilience. Now, this is a bit more difficult as a concept to grasp, but if you remember, so with alcohol, it's a chemical depressant, and your brain seeks to counter that sedating effect by becoming overly sensitive. So when it wears off, you're left anxious and slightly depressed. And of course, the more you drink, the more anxious and depressed you feel afterwards. And then when you drink again, you're relieving that anxiety and that depression. Now, it goes a lot deeper than just a bit of anxiety or depression or whatever it is. It actually erodes our mental resilience. So for most people, generally speaking, they'll be fairly confident, fairly happy, fairly positive, and they get through life dealing with problems as and when they can. Okay, but alcohol withdrawal removes that ability. It makes everything look too scary to want to face up to. And I've mentioned this a few times, but if you think of problems coming from 1 to 10, so 1 being the most minor and 10 being the most serious, most healthy people will be able to deal with, say, everything up to a 7 fairly easily. They've got that resilience and confidence and strength of character to deal with, say, everything up to a 7. Whereas the more you drink, the less you can deal with. So if you're hungover, you can only deal with sort of up to a 3 or a 4. And for the chronic alcoholic who's 3 bottles of spirits a day and really badly withdrawing, they literally can't function doing anything without an alcoholic drink. Now, the problem is that mental resilience, when you have it, it's very, very difficult to remember how debilitating it was to function without it. And like pain, we can remember kind of the theory of it, but it's very hard to remember the actuality. If anyone suffered from excruciating pain, almost as soon as it's over, you kind of remember how bad it is, but you can never quite get back to how painful it was when you feel it. And that's the same with mental resilience. When it's gone, and when you have it, you can't quite remember, how was I ever that weak mentally? You just take your current situation for granted. So what often happens is, when we stop drinking, fading effect bias and ambition kicks in to make us feel like, or look back on our drinking far more positively than it was when we actually experienced it. But what also happens is, as we get our mental resilience back, we kind of can't remember what it was like to not be able to stop. And this kind of feeds into when people say, you know, I stopped drinking, I found it incredibly easy, and then I've started again and I just can't stop the second time. A lot of it is perception. Actually, it was that difficult to quit the first time, but when you get those first few days and weeks under your belt and you get that mental resilience back, everything falls into place and it all becomes much, much easier. Now, the problem is, when you have that mental resilience back, you feel like if something goes wrong when you start drinking again, that you can beat it again. You feel like you're in control, and indeed you are. You've got that resilience and strength of character. But in that situation, doing things you want to do, like diet or exercise, becomes easier because you've got that strength of character to do it. But when it's robbed, everything becomes more difficult. So when we quit drinking and we get that mental resilience back, we forget how hard it was and how difficult and what it's like to not have that confidence to be able to deal with things like stopping drinking. So if you bear in mind those three different elements, so fading effect bias generally is quite a long-term thing. We're talking about months and years. We're looking at much further into the past. Ambition, wanting something you can't have, can be almost immediate. And that's exactly the same situation. You know, I think we've all had it where, you know, you're with someone and you don't want to be with them, but when the reality of splitting up with them comes along, actually you get cold feet and you don't really want to. It's that quick. Suddenly you're looking at things from a completely different perspective. You're not looking at them as something you've got and you're finding fault with. Suddenly they're not there anymore and you want them back. So that's almost immediate. The mental resilience thing kicks in, depending on how heavily you've been drinking for, from anything between a day and 3 or 4 weeks. You start to get that mental resilience back. And that often feeds into, and this is how I used to drink, which was very heavy binges for 3 or 4 days at a time and then stopping drinking. And you're almost like a split personality, because when you're coming out of the binge, you feel awful and dreadful and you just never want to drink again. But a few days later, you've got that resilience back and you kind of look back on it and think, oh, it's fine, I'm going to start drinking again. So these concepts all kind of kick in. And they do, as I say, they do have their different time periods, but you do need to bear in mind that ambition will kick in almost immediately, and that mental resilience will kick in as well. So yes, it is strange how the awfulness of drinking can be forgotten so easily, but that unfortunately is just human nature. That's how our brains work. You know, we idolise what we don't have. And as weeks turn into months, we tend to look back on the past far more positively than it was. So I suppose that brings us on to the third comment there. What can I do to avoid this? And that's really the key, isn't it? And I think, to be honest, for me, it is as simple as being aware of it. Because a lot of these things, I kind of think of it as lazy thinking, just letting your brain do what it wants without reining it in. So when you stop drinking, at some point you will start looking back on your drinking years and thinking that actually they were quite fun and you did have some good times. That's the time to stop and put a bit of effort in and to just remember the reality of what it was actually like. If it was like that, you wouldn't have stopped. It really is that simple. If drinking was what we think it is, you know, after we've quit or when we're fantasising about it, no one would ever quit, because it would be fun and enjoyable and have very little downside, but that's not the reality. So often with these things as ever, it's just sticking with the reality. And this is why journaling in the early days, I think, is really good. And also keeping a diary leading up to when you stop, because you have a written record of how miserable life was while you were drinking to refer back to. And that always makes it much, much easier. So there's a few, actually, I've already done 15 minutes. I always try to keep these things sort of 15, 20 minutes. I don't like them going on too long. So I hope that's kind of explained there a bit. There's a few sort of minor questions which I'll go through a bit quicker. One of them actually, not sure what to ask anymore, but I'll be listening. That's a good point, because it does sort of feel like we cover the same topics over and over again. But I kind of think if it's useful for people, that's fine. So if if there is something you want to ask that has been asked 100 times before, please do pop it in, because I don't think repeating things is necessarily a bad thing. One question here was, how much do you have to want to give up alcohol rather than needing to? That, I think, is just a simple question about mindset, isn't it? Because if you need to quit, that kind of suggests that actually you don't want to. And if you don't want to quit, that's presumably because you still see the fun, enjoyable, happy side of drinking. And so that's a simple mindset change. You need to see the reality of drinking for what it is. And I think that ties in with another question. But anyway, I'll come on to that later. The fact of the matter is, don't forget, with alcohol, it's just a drug in a drink, okay? And it's a drug that makes you feel slightly dull and a bit confused before then making you feel anxious. And then when you drink again, it relieves that anxiety that it caused in the first place. And that is all there is to it. So that is the reality, okay? It gets confusing because a lot of people are addicted to it and they like to portray that fun, enjoyable element. So whenever you put social media or the TV on, there's always people relaxing and enjoying themselves with alcohol. It's further confused because we tend to drink in situations when we're enjoying ourselves anyway, like socialising. So that lovely alcohol buzz you get when you're out with your friends is actually an endorphin buzz that you get from socialising. It's nothing to do with the alcohol. So that entire mindset change is about, for me anyway, it was about education and understanding. And of course, when you want to give up alcohol rather than needing to, that's pretty much when the prison is unlocked, isn't it? Because if you don't want to do something and your entire brain is gauged up to not doing it and not wanting to do it, then the problem's solved. In fact, here's the other comment. The feeling that life is flat and monotonous without the temporary high alcohol gives. The related feeling that life will always be a struggle and that others are happier because they can drink once or twice a week. So, firstly, there is no high to alcohol. It's a sedative. Okay, it doesn't give you a high. It can make you feel slightly dulled, and that is it. If you're out with your friends and drinking, as I've just said, the high is an endorphin high that you get from socialising. It's nothing at all to do with the alcohol. Okay, the alcohol can feed into it because we are creatures of society, and to a large degree when we're out socialising, there's also an element of nervousness and, you're worrying about what people think of you or if you say something stupid. Now, when you're in that situation without alcohol, eventually you settle into the occasion and then you get that endorphin rush. The quicker way of getting it is to take a sedative, which takes the edge off your nerves, which then releases the endorphins maybe 10 or 15 minutes earlier. But there is no high with alcohol. And the others are happier because they can drink once or twice a week. So for me, one of the big things with alcohol is it ruins sleep. And I've said this many times before, but imagine if you're at your best after 8 hours sleep and you sleep from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Drinking alcohol is like setting an alarm for 3 or 4 in the morning every night and getting up and drinking 7 or 8 mugs of strong black coffee and then not being able to sleep for the whole rest of the night. That is not something I would want to do, and that is not something I would envy anyone else for doing, and I would struggle to see why anyone's happier because they're doing that. People do it because they're fooled into thinking alcohol has far more benefits than downsides, and in fact a lot of people just don't associate anxiety and insomnia with drinking. I don't know why you'd envy them that ignorance, because they're suffering dreadfully for it and living a drastically reduced quality of life because of it. So again, that to me seems like a mindset thing. I think you need to get to grips with the reality of drinking and what it does and doesn't do for you. And you might find that problem solved. Any tips for being the only sober person in a heavy drinking family? I had a similar thing to that, actually. And to be honest, all you can do is just stick to your guns. But what I would say is this. The traditional way to stop drinking was to give up this wonderful drug because you're a sad, benighted individual who happens to be addicted to it when no one else is. Okay, that's of course nonsense. But of course, if you're going at it through that way, you're going to sit there fairly miserable at social occasions. Okay, the reality and the way we're opening up these days is to actually you're giving up something that is fairly unpleasant all round, and you should be fairly glad to be rid of it. And if you go about socialising the right way, you can enjoy yourself far more through not drinking than when you were drinking. And actually, if you start doing that, you will probably find, particularly if you're in a heavy drinking family, that people will start to question their own drinking and start to speak to you quite seriously about them stopping themselves. Because the reality is these days, anyone who drinks heavily is going to suffer. They're going to suffer with lethargy, tiredness, hangovers. And if they see you enjoying your life so much happier and so much better off because you've stopped drinking, they will be interested, and then you can start talking to them. And if it goes well, you might find that you're not the only person in that heavy drinking family who doesn't drink anymore. There'll be people starting to join you. Any advice for getting your life together and getting things done when stopping drinking? Well, I think the fact of the matter is when you stop and you get your mental resilience back and you also start sleeping better, your quality of life does improve dramatically. And one of the ways in which it happens is you have a lot more energy. So if it's early days and it specifically says stopping drinking, what I would say is don't worry too much about, those early first few days or weeks. What I would say is wait until you start sleeping better and you start getting your energy back, and that mental resilience, and you'll probably find yourself attacking these things fairly effectively anyway. So I think it will come naturally as time goes by. Just having a look at some of the other comments. How do we overcome the unconscious part of ourselves that drives us to self-destruct, or just keep us in that below-par state that stops us from achieving or actually thriving on a consistent level? Don't forget, the subconscious mind, all it does is trigger thoughts of having a drink. It's what you do after that that's the issue. So the subconscious will trigger the thought of a drink, but that isn't the craving for a drink. The craving is then consciously fantasizing about alcohol. And as I've mentioned before, it's the idea and not the reality of drinking that drags us in. Okay, so again, and I've been through this a lot of times anyway, so I won't go into huge amounts of detail. Just stick with the reality. Your subconscious will catch up fairly quickly, but all your subconscious does is put the thought of an alcoholic drink in your mind. So what you need to do is worry less about the subconscious and more about what you do with that thought. You will get the thought of an alcoholic drink in your mind loads and loads of times because 80% of the population drink. It's what you do with that thought. If you start then fantasizing about drinking and thinking how wonderful it will be to have a drink, then you're going to struggle. Okay, but if you just think to yourself, thank God I don't have to do that nonsense anymore, things will be a lot easier. And again, that's that mindset shift. So I've read both of your books and they make so much sense. I'm about to go on holiday with some friends in our motorhomes, and one of the things we do when we arrive at the campground, we crack a beer to celebrate our safe arrival. I know I can have an alcohol-free beer, but part of me thinks that someone will be disappointed if I don't join them in having a regular beer. So there's a few points here, I think. Firstly, and I've mentioned this before as well, but we kind of build up not drinking to be more than it is. So humans tend to be very sort of egocentric, unsurprisingly. We're concentrating on what we experience and what our lives provide us. Okay, so we kind of think that when we're going to say to people we're not drinking, that's going to be the most important thing to them because it's important to us. But actually most people aren't that bothered about whether you're drinking or not. They're only interested about whether they get to drink. And if you think back to all the times you were drinking where maybe people were there who weren't drinking, there may be a bit of conversation or a bit of joking around it, but it pretty quickly gets forgotten. So firstly, I would say, don't worry too much. It's probably not going to be as bad as you think anyway. Secondly, I'll go back to what I mentioned before. The best thing you can do is just to go there and enjoy yourself and be happy, which you will be without alcohol anyway. And actually, you might tempt some people into joining you. And don't forget as well that on holiday, and this is a difficult one, particularly when you get there, because it is very stressful and you're unpacking all the rest of it, it is really nice to sit down when it's all done. But that's the pleasure in the situation. The pleasure isn't the alcohol. As I say, all that's going to do is make you feel more slightly dulled and then ruin your night's sleep, which is then going to impact the following day. So keep that in mind as well. You'll be the one waking up on holiday feeling refreshed and happy, whereas the others won't be. And I'm not talking about full-blown hangovers as well. As we know, even 1 or 2 drinks will ruin your sleep, stop you waking up feeling refreshed and happy and ready to go. Someone's put here, do you do virtual races? Anyone else runs on this Facebook group? We can do a virtual run together. I'm not sure what that is, but do feel free to post something if you think there might be some interest in it. Certainly an interesting one. Related to Alcohol Explained, Chapter 20, Self-Image, what are some specific ways to build subconscious beliefs that promote independence, imagination, intelligence, ability to act, apart from the herd mentality? So self-image, that's just to do with how we perceive ourselves. And if you see yourself as a drinker, you need to kind of change that a bit when you stop drinking. So the problem is a lot of our self-image. So when we're drinking, we tend to build up this self-image of ourselves, and we kind of think of, we tend to, with the self-image as well, you tend to look down on people that don't fulfil your category of self-image. Okay, so if you're a drinker, you tend to look down on non-drinkers. You kind of, in the same way meat eaters kind of look down on vegetarians. It's that kind of thing. And I suppose as well, smokers look down on non-smokers. Whatever your self-image is, you tend to build it up above everyone else. So when you quit drinking, if you don't do some work on your self-image, you kind of retain that self-image. So you become a non-drinker, but you still kind of look down on non-drinkers and think they're boring and a bit weird. So you need to change that self-image. I don't know so much that you need to build subconscious beliefs. I think you just need to bear in mind, again, for me, it's just about the reality. When you quit drinking, you're fitter, you're stronger physically, and you're mentally stronger. And that's a fairly positive self-image to have, I think. Waking up feeling refreshed and able to tackle life is a positive self-image. Now, everyone's individual, and they'll be building many nuances around that. But I think that's as good a starting point as any. Is to have that image of someone who is strong mentally and physically, fitter than they were previously, and able to tackle life and enjoy it, I think is as good a starting place as any. So last one then, I'm curious about this crazy wine culture in France. Does wine really elevate the flavour of certain foods? It's hard living here because about 10 times a day I hear I'm missing out on this certain cheese with red wine or that lovely fish with a dry white. I seem to be enjoying my food just fine, so there's no temptation. Is this just a lie people tell themselves? Yes, basically, it is a lie. But it's one that does feed into some reality, because this is an interesting one really. But again, going back to the brain basically having its own chemicals, drugs and hormones, and dividing them largely into stimulants and depressants. So depressants are things that calm things down and inhibit nerve activity, and stimulants do the opposite. They tend to speed things up and make you feel more alert and more awake. But rather confusingly, appetite stimulants are depressants. So if you take a sedative, it usually makes you feel hungrier, rather bizarrely. Now, the reason for this is when you eat, your body takes up a huge amount of energy in digesting. Your digestive tract, I can't remember, it's 12 or 14 foot of intestine, and there's muscles that squeeze the food all the way along it. So when you eat, your body diverts a lot of energy into digestion. Okay, so your body likes to eat when you are relaxing. So depressants, which relax things, cause you to want to be hungry. So traditionally, alcohol is a proven appetite stimulant. Okay, so there is a close relationship between alcohol and eating, which is one of the reasons why when people drink they get fat. Apart from the fact there's empty calories in alcohol, it makes you eat more. And of course, it then numbs the receptors that tell you that you're full. And for all these reasons, it makes you eat more and more and more. So to a degree, there is some sort of reality involved in that if you're drinking, you're going to be able to overeat, which itself is not a particularly pleasant or enjoyable pastime. But that tends to be why certain foods are linked with drinking and eating tend to go so closely together. As for it elevating the flavour, I mean, don't forget, wine is just grape juice. So I don't really understand how the flavour of a grape is going to make something like cheese taste any different, to be honest. But of course, this is France. So, being English, I have very little understanding of what goes on over there. Anyway, I hope that was useful, everyone. I'll probably post again towards the end of next week to see if there's interest on another Friday live session. And until then, hope we're all well. Thank you very much for listening.